While we recognize the farm sector is only one sector of the food and fiber system, it is certainly a crucial one. The farm sector is the one that raises the farm products and supplies them to manufacturers and processors to add value to the products. So, while every single sector is important, without the farm sector, we would have to agree products would not become available. So, to take a look at farming, it has changed over the last century. Number one, probably the biggest change, is there are less farms than there used to be, but there are larger. Farmers have done a very good job of increasing their capital comparing to labor. We'll talk about what that means in a second. But most importantly, the ability to be productive, or the amount of output we get per unit of input, has increased dramatically over time. On the financial side, the income has been growing, the nominal net farm income. There has been less debt that farmers have had, and then the real estate values are helping to create an equity for farmers. It's not necessarily that the fact the farmers have a very valuable crop. It's just the land that they own, that the crop sits upon, is exceptionally valuable and has a lot of equity. So financially, farmers are pretty well off comparatively. The number of farms today is roughly at 2.1 million, and that's much lower than the 1935 peak. But since World War II, in the 40s, the average farm size has doubled to about 440 acres. Now, I'm not a huge fan of this particular graphic because when you look at it, it's talking about the number of farms that we have in agriculture, and we can see the trend seems to be the farms increase, and then something happens a little bit later and they decrease, and then they increase, and then they decrease. And while that is certainly the trend, I want you guys to quickly recognize that whenever you see a graph, we have to go ahead and analyze the graph itself before we can arrive to any kind of conclusions. On the one axis, it has the numbers of farms. The other one has the years. But just recognize, it's not giving us the most complete picture because this corner axis, it didn't start in farms over time. It just started from the 1990s. But as importantly, it started at about 2 million farms. And so while there has been trends that have gone up and gone down, those trends have been roughly 150,000 farms that are added and 150,000 farms go away. And that trend goes up and down, but you can see if the axis had 0 at the very bottom, this line would be a lot more stabilized. So while there has been this modulation in farms, it's not quite as crazy a picture as this graph would have us believe. So make sure you analyze the graph before you draw a conclusion about what the graph represents. Over time, we can see that the farm size has changed a little bit, and there's a minor trend that it's increased about 20 acres over the last 10 years. But it's also nice to see that the value per acre has gone up. Agriculture farmland is very valuable today, and so we can see that increase in value. But I think what's even more interesting is the idea of the concentration. And so let's think about this. There's about 2.2 million farms, and 50,000 of those 2.2 million produce roughly 50% of the total sales. So 2% of the farms create half of the total sales in agriculture. So these 2% of the farms certainly have a lot of production power. Now, most of the farms, 56% of the farms, have sales of less than $10,000. And this is per year, not per day. So one of the reasons why this is the case, 56% of the U.S. farms have sales less than $10,000, is the United States Department of Agriculture define a farm as any agricultural operation that has had the sales of or the potential to make sales of $2,000. And so if any of you guys listening to this video have ever shown an animal at Kern County Fair, you've probably made more than $2,000, and therefore the USDA considers you a farmer. So the vast majority of the farms are very, very small. When you consider the concentration again, we can see that 10% of the farms, a very small amount, account for 75% of the overall production. So very few farms are producing the vast majority of our agricultural products. It's good to know that U.S. farms tend to be specialized rather than diversified, meaning that they will go ahead and grow a single product, and that's all. About half of the U.S. farms produce one economy. 3/4 of the farms with sales of less than $500,000 produce no more than 3 commodities. Now, many of us in this area are aware that we have the wonderful Farming Corporation, which is one of the largest in the nation, and they're a little bit more diversified compared to most. Grimway, which used to be exclusive carrots, has been becoming much more diversified with their organic vegetable products, but most of the farms produce one commodity. I know many farmers that are amazing almond farmers, and if almonds ever have a bad year, I guess the saying goes, they put all their eggs in one basket and they're going to have a bad year. The more diversified you are, the better you can protect yourself from single commodity challenges. Interestingly enough, 60% of all farms are comprised of retired operators or people that were like my father and worked off the farm. So they had a secondary job plus they farmed. And then for most of you guys, it should be good news. The average farmer, the average person that produces our commodities, is in their mid-50s, meaning that we have an older population and we are going to be looking for some new blood very, very quickly. There is a big idea out there that the corporate farms versus family farms, agriculture is very industrialized. It's a corporation that is ran by a board of directors, and I think it's important to understand that while we recognize the farms themselves are large, most farms are family-owned farms. The Grimway Corporation, which is a huge farm and the #1 employer in Kern County, is still owned by the Grimm family. They are a family-owned farm. If you wanted to consider Wonderful, Wonderful is predominantly owned by Linda and Stuart Resnick. While they are a corporation that you and I can buy stock in, they are still a large family farm. Now, Grimway and Wonderful are larger corporations, but most farms are organized as individual operations and some as partnerships. So the idea that every single farm is a large corporation simply is not factual. But what is factual is partnerships and corporations themselves account for 40% of the value of the production. So corporations and partnerships certainly are very, very productive. From a financial point of view, farmers have become less dependent on terminal markets and spot pricing and have relied more on some contracts. An idea of a contract would be if you were a alfalfa hay producer and you're producing alfalfa hay, you might go ahead and enter a contract with a dairy farmer and tell him in April of 21, I'm going to go ahead and deliver 700 tons of alfalfa hay to you at the price of $140 per ton. And you lock in your prices. You create a contract. At that time, in April of 21, you know you have a guaranteed buyer, and the dairyman knows he has a guaranteed supplier. So we'll see a lot of the idea of the farmer showing up with a bunch of wheat and figuring out what the price of wheat is and therefore what their profitability is going to be has really changed over time. When we take a look at our farming inputs, land, labor, capital, materials, these are the inputs of production. And it is not possible to produce a product without land, labor, capital, and materials. When we take a look at these, we'll break them down a little bit more this chapter, but labor is very, very expensive, as is capital. Very, very expensive. But the most expensive is still land. It is more challenging to become a producer today because the average person doesn't have the money in their pocket or in the cushions of their couch to purchase land. As an aside, the United States Department of Agriculture has a program that is prepared to loan money to young people or people that are not traditionally in an ownership position in agriculture. Happens to be oftentimes women, veterans, some minorities, and they're offering the finances to go ahead and get started in agriculture. So if that is a passion of yours, there are resources out there to do that. But when we take a look at the farm inputs, we can see over time when we have the 1996 base year that with the exception of a funny, weird year around 1980, for the most part, we can see the trend is pretty flat and level. So farm inputs haven't changed a lot over time. So while it's been made pretty stable, just recognize that as the price of labor has increased, agriculturalists have decided to maybe spend a little bit less on labor and more on materials, a little bit less on labor and more on capital. So meaning instead of hiring a bunch of people to do a job, they would buy a piece of capital, a piece of machinery that would increase their production. And when we take a look at it, we can see by this particular graph that the amount of labor has decreased over time, the amount of materials has increased over time, and capital is now on the decrease over time. Utilizing 1996 as our base year. So we are able to compare because we've used an index to go ahead and normalize everything in 1996. Now, let's have a quick conversation about productivity. Productivity is defined as the output per unit of input. And so it's the amount of corn that we get per seed we were planted, or the amount of corn we get per water irrigated. So our productivity has increased dramatically over time, and the primary reason for this increase has been to the development of technology and biotechnology. Not only has livestock increased, but crop output has increased about 2% every year. And so to say that over time, since World War II, we have improved our ability by 2%, not many industries can suggest that. And the fact that we can feed so much more of the world is a pretty powerful position to be in. We have certainly taken part in genetically engineered crops since they began to come into place in 1996. Some of the genetic engineering has been things like the herbicide tolerant traits, Monsanto's Roundup Ready corn, soybeans, alfalfa, corn that has been created with insect resistant traits. They were able to go ahead and realize that the cotton boll weevil would not attack some plants, but it attacked cotton. So they were able to isolate what was in that one plant that the boll weevil didn't like and transpose that genetically into cotton and minimize the amount of, insect damage in the cotton without having to spray a bunch of herbicides and chemicals. When we take a look at the overall productivity, realizing that this is a 1996 data. So we're comparing this to what happened in 1996, and you can see that the productivity has increased pretty significantly. When we look at the overall farm sector, the output in 1996 data has gone up. And when we look at it from the livestock point of view, we see a very similar trend using the 1996 as the base. And that is also the case in crop production using 1996 as the base. We have in agriculture become more proficient, and we have been able to do a better job with our resources, producing more with less inputs of production.